is our focus on financial crime compliance. It's all about building frameworks and executing effective programs. We learn the most from case studies and how to put these frameworks and ideas into action. How does it all fall in place in the macro scheme of things? So ladies and gentlemen, this is a case study that we will be playing on the theme of focusing on the financial crime compliance. For this, please join me in welcoming the Chief Compliance Officer at HBL Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together to welcome Mr. Waheed Rathore.
So, assalamu alaikum everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to this session. I would like to start by thanking the organizers, most of who have seemed to have disappeared, but still, those who are here, thank you very much for this opportunity. Privileged to be speaking at this forum. The topic assigned to me today was to essentially come up and speak about building a financial crimes framework, and then the effectiveness of the same. Now, I thought about it for some time, and there were two ways I could go about it. I could actually come up with that building blocks kind of a thing where I talk to you about the elements of financial crime risk framework. But then I looked at the audience and I thought, this is not, the fundamentals of financial crime kind of a forum. You're all seasoned professionals. You've been in the sector. You've been fighting this battle for a long time. So it wouldn't be fair to go to that elementary level and start talking about what's what and how it's supposed to be done. So I've tried to do a different approach here, and let me see if I'm successful with this attempt. And the idea really is to not just go with the typical building blocks of, you start with governance, and then you have these committees, and then you have the policies and the framework and all that. I just wanted to do a little bit of a behind the numbers, behind the boxes kind of a discussion today. I've been assigned 20 minutes, and 25 being a bit gracious, but I thought these will be important things to talk about. And the starting point of it can be arguably putting the governance framework first, or the starting point could be how do you get to getting the right governance framework. And I thought I'll start with the first piece in terms of how to start, second piece of how to start with the governance framework. So if you talk about the financial crimes compliance strategy, I thought the starting point of this debate would be at an institutional level, what is the financial crime compliance strategy for the institution? And I think the right way to start with this debate and discussion is to first look at what is your enterprise risk? What business are you in? What products are you in? What channels are you in? What markets you operate? And once you've done an assessment of those, that is just the beginning of the thought process. This is where the brainstorming starts. This is where the deliberation starts. This is where the challenge starts. Because when you do the enterprise-wide risk assessment, the view of the first line could be very different from the view of the second line, and the third line, of course, has their own view, which is sometimes very different and unique. But the deliberations in terms of convergence to what business are we in and what is the risk in the businesses that we do, that has to be the starting point of this debate. And if you make it an art, which means you want to take everybody's opinion and you want to build consensus around it, it's going to be a difficult thing to achieve. So therefore, how you best do an enterprise-wide risk assessment is to be realistic, and at the same time, you have to essentially do it based on empirical evidence. It has to be data-driven in strategy. So the two components that you're talking about is essentially an internal risk assessment of the business that you are in, the markets you are in, the products, the geographies, the channels, the customers. Empirically driven, in terms of looking at where your concentrations are, looking at where your transactional volumes are, looking at where your vulnerabilities are, looking at historical trends of where your unusual suspicious activities are coming from, putting it all together. Once you have that picture done to some extent, then you top it up with what your national risk assessment is saying. You cannot do this activity in isolation. So what your national risk assessment is saying in terms of, and it's also a sort of a sanity check in terms of what you have done. So what your national risk assessment is saying will confirm or contradict your internal risk assessment, whether you have factored the right risks in terms of the sectors, in terms of the ownership structures, and so on. So your national risk assessment is going to either validate your internal assessment or it's going to contradict. And then, of course, the next point is to again, make sure that you calibrate and converge both these elements together to come up with the overall assessment. This presentation is not very clear to me, so yeah. So then once we have done the risk assessments, enterprise-wide risk assessment, you then try to see what is the outcome of this enterprise risk assessment. And there are multiple outcomes of it. When I say use cases, outcomes, decisions, there are multiple. One of that is the risk proportionate allocation of resource and capital. Once you know where your hot buttons are, where your risk pockets are, you have to, as a chief compliance officer, in consultation with your business stakeholders, in consultation with your executive and the board committees, make sure that you allocate the right level of resource and capital to the right level of risk. You do that successfully, you have something pretty defendable and actionable that you can then start to run with. Now, once that has happened, then you talk about knowing your internal risk, knowing your external factors, micro, macro, NRA, everything, empirically driven, MIS, data. Then you start developing your thought process in terms of what is your risk appetite and risk tolerance. Now, these are the two terms which are more often than not confused, not just within these two terms, but also in terms of the larger concept of what we are talking about. So when we talk about a risk appetite is essentially the amount of risk that an organization is willing to take in pursuit of its business objectives. Now, business objectives can be different, varied, your market share, numbers, volumes, profitability, bottom line, ROE, ROI. The risk tolerance is essentially the degree of variance that the organization is willing to take in terms of the variance from the tolerance. So you could say, fine, this is my risk appetite, and by the way, a zero tolerance is a misnomer. I absolutely disagree with it. You cannot be in the business of banking and risk and say I have a zero tolerance on compliance risk. You can't. But it's fashionable to say that, and we all say that, and we use it, and we throw it at different forums and so on. So is the degree of variance. So you could say, my risk appetite on this is zero, but I can vary up to 1%, 2% from this zero tolerance appetite. I'm just giving a hypothetical example. And in the pursuit of this business objective. Now you apply these tolerances to each of the business objectives. You just don't do it at a one-size-fits-all kind of a thing. You apply it to the specific objectives and the strategy that the organization is following. And that gives you the risk tolerances against each objective. Once you do that, you are then starting to track it for the purpose of executive decisioning, for the purpose of board oversight and reporting. The other thing that I want to clarify here is that you cannot say, as I earlier said, that you have a zero risk appetite on everything, right? First of all, a financial crime risk appetite, again, can be broken down into various components. You could have a risk appetite, terror finance, absolutely zero, non-negotiable. But you cannot say that I have a zero risk appetite on money laundering. If you say that, you're setting yourself up something. Sanctions, perhaps zero because of the gravity and what it ends up bringing to all of us in terms of the pain. Then you talk about anti-bribery, corruption, insider trading, so on and so forth in the larger scheme of financial crime. But then you step back a little bit and you look at the regulatory compliance aspect of it. Can anyone here sitting, put your hand on the heart and say that we have a zero tolerance against regulatory breaches? If anybody says that, I would really like to come and give you a big, bear hug, because all of us, in one way or other, have been breaching certain regulatory requirements, and we have been, we've got some rap on the knuckles, sometimes financial, sometimes a reprimand, sometimes just a call, or in a different tone. So the composite risk appetite of any institution has to be broken down into more granular components of financial crime and regulatory compliance. And once you do that, then you aggregate that into a composite risk appetite, which again, you can then develop further risk tolerances for each of the elements in that. Excuse me. Then we move on to the governance structure. I think this issue has been beaten to death. It has been discussed so much. We had a discussion about it in the morning. Everybody knows what the board responsibility is. Everybody knows what the board committee oversight is. Ideally, we would, in some governance models, see compliance reporting directly into the board. Sometimes there's a hybrid. Sometimes there's just an eyewash. Coming from some of the markets that I've dealt with, I can say that it is actually an eyewash. It doesn't happen in reality, even if it happens on paper. But the key components, of course, are the board committee, the TORs, the executive committee responsibility, the role of the executives, the three lines of defense, first, second, third, the CEO role, all right? And the CEO role has, of course, gone through a tremendous amount of change. Sidra, if you could just give me some, if you can just give me some indications of how much time do I have, please? 3 minutes? Bad timing, shouldn't have asked. So 3 lines of defense and IT governance. IT governance is, in this age of digitalization and cyber, it is becoming of paramount importance. So I'll have to really gallop through this. Policies and procedures. This is, to me, the logical next step. Once you know your EWRA outputs, your risk appetite, your risk tolerances, only then you can develop a good AML, KYC, CFT sanctions policy. If you do it without this, you will be doing it based on what you have in the stomach, not from here. So the days of the stomach, the feel is gone. Now you have to not just do a policy, you have to do an actionable policy. You have to convince the executive that you're going to do it. You have to convince the board that you have to do it. You have to convince your third line. You have to convince your external auditor. You have to convince your regulator, right? And this is only possible if you can back it up with MIS and data to show that what you're talking about in terms of implementation of certain policy changes and parameters, these are not coming from the stomach, these are coming from actually data-driven analysis. People, skills, capacity, of course, you're required to, on a constant basis, skill and reskill. It is something which is an ongoing process. CPD, continuous professional development, is something that otherwise we'll all become dinosaurs. We will disappear. Some of us have already disappeared in a way. So it is very important that you cascade the skills assessment and upgrade on an ongoing basis amongst the ranks, which are basically your people who are actually managing the risk for you. Technology. Integrated FCC platform. Now, I think sometimes we are not very effective, despite the fact that we spend so much time and money, and everybody was talking about the cost of compliance, because sometimes the system that we have, they don't talk to each other. And we don't have an organizational view of risks. So one of the expectations from a governance point of view from the executive management and the CEO and the board is to create a process and an ability within the organization where pieces of information that sit in different parts of the organization come together for collective and informed decision making. This is an expectation. This is not a nice to have. So if the organization has not created that environment or that kind of a structure, operating in silos, you can never say that you're managing the risk on an end-to-end basis. And it's so often happened that you de-risk a customer in one part of the bank and you still continue to do the business with the same customer in the other part of the bank. And when somebody picks it up, we all have egg on our face and we don't know what to do and what to say. So this is important. But what is more important is, when it comes to these integrated platforms, is first, the stability of the platform. We all know that not all platforms work well at all times. We will have sometimes we have a parameter issue, sometimes we have one scenario not firing, sometimes we have one transaction being alerted in 9 different scenarios, and sometimes you don't have centralized case management, so you don't know the case that sanctions team is working on and the AML team is working on. They're all operating in silos. They have different pieces of information on which they base their decisions, but the outcome is not always. So stability of the system is very important. Once you have stabilized the system, that is a risk play. It is important to understand what are the drivers. That's a risk play. Once you have a stable system, then you can go into the efficiency play. And you can say, okay, I want to reduce the noise, I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to reduce my alert generation by 20%, 30%, whatever. That's the efficiency play. You cannot bring efficiency into an unstable system. That is counterintuitive. You cannot expect that, you cannot ask for it, you cannot do it, period. Once these 2 steps are done, then you look at model validation. Model validation has come up, I think, in the last 6-7 years when FinCEN came out and they said to all US banks, we want you to get your models independently verified. And we've been having these discussions in the Wolfsburg Forum where John has been in some of these discussions, where the American banks have actually cried to FinCEN in those forums and said, you are killing us. We are spending tens of millions of dollars in just getting our models validated. Let us do internally. FinCEN in those forums said, no way. We want this to be independent. So the consultants have become multimillionaires. The Ferrari sales went up, and the mansions everywhere were being sold left and right. But the reality is, model validation is so much of a focus in mature markets that they don't care whether the banks are spending $10 million, $20 million just on model validation. They just want an assurance that the model is, your systems are generating what they're supposed to generate, right? You can have it on the in terms of some sheets and all that, but they actually want to test. And trust me, when it's done independently, there always will be something which will not be working as you thought it was working. And that is something which is very important for you as the industry professionals, practitioners. It's very important for the executive management. It's very important for the board. And it is very, very important for the regulator. So this model validation is going to become a hygiene factor going forward. It's not going anywhere, rest assured about that. Analytics, MIS, again, we've talked about it. We've talked about data-driven decisioning. We've talked about use of AI and so on. But again, if you have an unstable system, if your system is not working properly, what AI you will deploy to it, right? So for AI to be of some value to you, the system has to reach a certain performance level. Unless they get to that, you'll be just completely throwing away the money for no real output. Dashboards are important, trends are important, MIS is important. You should know the direction of risk. It is not about the point-in-time risk situation. That's good to know. It's good to know what risk you are sitting on. But what is even better to know, or what is expected of you to know, is the direction of risk. Where are we going with this risk? Directionally, are we doing the right target markets? Are we doing the right products? Are we doing the right channels? Subab, uski baat hui hai. There is no point having the sexiest front of digitalization of customer onboarding if your entire backend is analog. You are going to create a wow for 7 seconds, and after that your inbox will be flooded with complaints. And eventually you will see things falling through the cracks and regulators coming and giving you a bashing as well, because you must have missed something somewhere. Monitoring, surveillance, assurance. I think this is again something where I have a view, and again, what I say today is my personal views. I don't represent the views of HBL here. I think the assurance QA methodologies that we have been applying so far are dead in the waters. They don't work anymore. These postmortems, looking at something, QA, doing some sample checking, coming up with a report going to someone looking at it, oh, I did this wrong, let me. By the time it happens, it's Christmas. There's no point in that assurance has lost its value. We need to move towards quick time, near real-time assurance, where you are constantly being assured as you are doing your day-to-day jobs. So it's a completely different thought. I'm probably a rebel in this, but I think the old QA assurance processes are absolutely redundant. They are gone. We need to look forward. What else? Breach reporting. Yeah. What is the last point? Audit function. Yeah. So that's, yeah, once you have that, let me know. Once you have a smart, intelligent, business partner in audit, third line of defense. Armagan is left, so I can say whatever I want to say now. Training and awareness. Culture awareness, role-based training, professional qualifications, CPD. These are, I'm not saying anything new. These are things that we've been speaking for ages. It's like brushing your teeth. We do it all the time. Whether we do it right or not is a different question. And whether we need to, at the age of 40, I was told by my dentist that I don't brush my teeth the way they were supposed to be brushed. I said, okay, fine. Is it a bit late in the day? And said, you're still lucky. Some people don't even realize till they die. So this is like one of those things. You have to invest. You have to put your thoughts into it. All these things, Mustafa is sitting here, my colleagues, he does a fantastic job at training need analysis, and we do brilliant jobs. So if somebody comes and says, we can present a beautiful presentation. Training need analysis also has to be intelligent and smart. You cannot assess the training needs based on how you have been thinking, but also directionally where you want your people to be looking at. So it is, as somebody was saying this morning, it is about forecasting where your risk is going to move directionally and what is going to become painful for you, and preparing your people to be able to handle that. Sidra, am I done with my time, or do? 2 minutes ago, thank you. So that was, okay. So I put together the slide. I'm not going to go through it because I think the crux was basically in the thought process in the previous slide. This is essentially telling you what are the common pitfalls. Where do organizations go wrong when they do this framework? And I've tried to put some examples. It was like almost 1:30 last night, and my brain had stopped working. Otherwise, I could have come up with a bit more. But this is essentially where they go wrong. I will not be able to go through each bullet, but it just gives you a sense of where. I don't want to say do's and don'ts because, again, it's very prescriptive, but this is where typically organizations have failed in addressing these elements of the framework right, and the mistakes they make and the consequences of the mistake. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take those questions. But this is a busy slide. My apologies for that. But A couple of basket cases really come to your mind. And if you look at it, there are 2-3 takeaways from that. BNP Paribas, Swedbank, let's pick up the biggest one and probably the most recent one. BNP Paribas, I'm not a fond of their governance structure. Some friends work there at senior levels, and I have told them, Matrix, and there are some other organizations which I will not take names. I don't want to piss people off towards the end. Matrix reporting structures, reporting here, reporting there, reporting region, reporting functional line, reporting there, absolute disaster. Nobody's accountable for it at the end. Nobody's responsible for it at the end. If you want to set yourself up for failure, confuse the lines of reporting and accountability, and inshallah, you will get there. Right? It's guaranteed. Absolute. Paribas is a classic case of that. Even if you look at Paribas now, it is an absolute mess. Every person has about 7 reporting lines. And if you do that, you know where you're going. Swedbank was, I don't know, I think I would want to think that they knew what they were doing. It is not that they were not aware. They knew that they were going to make money in this business line. They kept going with it. It was just that I think healthy tension to ek alada baat hoti. I think the compliance officer was probably sitting in the lap of the business or vice versa. I don't know. So I think it was a collective failure at the executive and the board level. So the governance is at the root cause of it. Even if they had identified the problems, they were not able to take tough decisions on it. And more often than not, it's a case of intention. Probably their risk appetite was very high, and they ended up where they ended up. Knowing from some of the industry colleagues who have been looking at Swedbank, bad, very bad, in terms of how they conducted themselves. So these are some of the takeaways from today's session. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take those questions. Otherwise, thank you very much. Am I allowed questions? Oh, okay, one.
Yeah, hi, Waheed. Most of the smart regulators that we have in Asia Pacific, for example, MAS or HKMA, have in fact taken a stand that TMS needs to be augmented with artificial intelligence and machine learning. How far do you think we are in Pakistan from augmenting this? And secondly, what to you are the easy wins that we can do in these 2 areas which could help the banks grow? And just on a separate note, I think there's a lot being done in terms of the internal audit function as a 3rd line as well, looking at compliance. So going back to your comment on Armurgan, I think we've started now bringing in CAM specialists and also people from compliance itself to help us with the audit function. So I think there's a lot of improvement there.
Oh, that's good. So first question first. HKMA, MAS are very forward-looking, futuristic regulators, having worked with them in the past. MAS in particular is very, very forward-looking. Now, the thing is, smaller markets, relatively matured markets, regional hubs of international global GSIBs, global institutions, those markets are, in terms of data quality, they are way ahead of where we are. I think Pakistan now has very rapidly caught up in terms of with this biometrics and with the NADRA and Verisis. I'm learning these terms. I'm sorry, I still don't know. If you ask me, I will probably not be able to tell you what this means, but I'm hearing these words. So we are ahead. So to give you a comparison, I think we are directionally right. Whether we are ready to apply AI and get benefit of it, and again, getting benefit is fine, but are you going to get the optimum value out of AI application at this point in time, it's too early for me to make that assessment. But I can tell you that if you compare to India, India just brought in their Aadhaar card in probably 2008, 2008. They didn't have a national identification. People were opening up accounts on ration cards, on voters list, and PAN cards, and they had all sorts of things. We had our ID cards back in the 70s, right? USA Patriot Act Customer Identification Program came out in 2002, where they started talking about primary identification, secondary identification. We had our ID cards in the 70s. So the Gulf was solely reliant on passports for purposes of account opening. They didn't have a national identity databases. We have. So once you bring these things into your banking sector, now again, there could be banks which are relatively advanced, there are banks which are relatively slow. State Bank is, I think, pushing everyone. So I think we will get there, but we can still do it, but we're not going to get the sweet out of it that we want to get. That was your first question. Second, you said about audit. I see that happening. I see what you said happening. But what is still, I think, the problem with this area of financial crime is that it always will have a level of judgment, art involved in it, in addition to the science, which is your science is your systems, your monitoring systems, your algos and everything. But the art is the judgment that you exercise and when you evaluate the risk. Problem is, if you put one case, and then there are a lot of industry colleagues setting it, each one of them can give their own opinion. And none of these opinions will match, I can guarantee you, right? So that's where the challenge is, that when regulators come, you give the same anonymous scenario for 5 different examiners and inspectors. Trust me, their observations will be different, right? So this is where the challenge is, and Armaghan is a friend, so I can take a bit of a crack at him, even in his absence. It will go to him, but it's okay. But I think this is a good revolving door. I think from compliance into other areas and other areas of compliance, just like the revolving door from regulator to practitioner and practitioner to regulator, I think this is a good enrichment. I was allowed one question.
Yes, please. I'm here. Javed.
I'm overridden, sir.
One question.
I'm overridden, sir.
Fast.
I'm happy to do that, yeah. Thank you. Apologies.
Thank you, Mr. Waheed Rathore. Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a big round of applause.